Hello and welcome back to another Doctor Who Big Finish audio drama review. In today's review we're going to be catching up with the 8th Doctor, Liv Chenka and Helen Sinclair in their latest box set of adventures entitled Connections. This release is available to purchase now on the official Big Finish website in both physical CD and digital download formats. It can also be purchased as a part of a bundle alongside the other releases within this series. So this box set consists of 3 separate 1-hour stories, the first of which is Here Lies Drax, as written by John Dorney, the second episode is The Love Vampires, as written by James Kettle, and the third and final episode is Albie's Angels, as written by Roy Gill. John Dorney returns to open the second box set of 8th Doctor adventures within this series, and it is a sequel to the Big Finish 4th Doctor adventure, The Trouble with Drax. Personally, I've never listened to this story, and I don't think it really affected my listening experience overall. Connections takes on a slightly different format to the previous box set in the series, being What Lies Inside, where this time we have 3 completely separate 1-hour stories. You don't need to have listened to the previous box set either in order to listen to this set. All you need to know is that the TARDIS is fixed after the events of Stranded, and the entirety of space and time is once again at this TARDIS team's fingertips. The Doctor receives a letter from Drax, who previously appeared within the Armageddon Factor on TV, except the letter asks the Doctor to protect a number of seemingly useless objects, and the invitation itself is one to his own funeral. What could possibly go wrong? I think it's an incredibly witty story, and Dorney writes comedy so very well. The scenes flow very naturally, and I think it really highlights the fun within this TARDIS team. It's certainly the more light-hearted episode within the set, with the other 2 stories being rather heavy on emotion. Liv and Helen are as great as ever, and I continue to feel an extreme comfort listening to this era of 8th Doctor stories. Shane Ritchie is perfect as Drax, really bold, chaotic and untrustworthy. That theme continues throughout the entirety of the narrative, as the TARDIS team embark on a grand adventure to stop the Quantum Assassin. My favourite moment within the story is the TARDIS team attending Drax's funeral, and it continuously gets interrupted. It really sets the scene for the story, as well as being a great laugh for the listener to experience. It's a great idea with everyone in attendance at the funeral not quite truly believing that Drax is actually gone. It is also a rather imaginative and funny way to start off this set, and part of me does think would it have perhaps benefited if this was episode 2 to kind of divide up the more emotionally heavy stories. It also really showcases the variety within John Dorney's writing, especially when you compare it to the brilliant time-bending story that we got to see within the previous set, also written by Dorney. As a story which isn't restricted by a faulty TARDIS, the story does use a lot of locations throughout the universe, giving the episode itself a rather universal feel. It twists and turns and may confuse some, with a lot of scenes going at quite a fast pace, so it may be one of those episodes that will benefit from a second listen. It's certainly not my favourite story of the set, simply because one of the upcoming episodes is incredible, but it's certainly some light-hearted fun. What I will say, however, is there is many twists and turns, revelations and references, and points for the listener to guess what the hell is going on, which made it quite a lot of fun to listen to. I suppose it's episodes the likes of this that we didn't really get within the likes of Stranded due to it being rather restricted to Earth, especially within the earlier volumes in that series. I suppose this kind of reverts back to some rather fun traditional Doctor Who with a bit of time bending in there as well. If I was to describe this episode very briefly, I'd basically say the Doctor and his friends are kind of assigning the elements of Drax's will and kind of needing to go around the universe picking up the pieces, collecting up his assets, while simultaneously protecting this box of seemingly useless objects. But as they go on this adventure, various things get in the way. They meet these various bold characters, and it soon turns out that Drax being Drax, he kind of owes people many things, leading to a rather sticky situation. I think you can kind of tell with this story, due to its rather jumpy complexity, that the conclusion of this episode is similarly quite jumpy and complex, and it kind of reminds me of The Curse of Fatal Death, where we have that scene with Rowan Atkinson, and he says, "I went back and bribed the architect." It's a bit like that. For the benefit of disclosure, I attempted to start The Love Vampires multiple times, but simply could not get into it. My first listen of this box set was in fact way back in December. I then got really busy with uni assessments, so that's when I kind of listened to Here Lies Drax, and then I paused my listening of this box set right up until early February. And here we are once again revisiting this story with an open, fresh mind. And I say that because sometimes things like this happen when you simply can't get into a story. Sometimes it may be the release itself and it's something that doesn't click with you, other times it may be yourself not being able to simply focus on the story or having too much on the mind. I think there is a very fine balance between being very stressed or thinking about a lot of things and listening to Big Finish to kind of distract you from that, but then also at the same time you can have that situation where you have that much on your mind, even trying to distract yourself with Big Finish simply doesn't work. I think what James Kettle provides within this story is actually a rather fun space vampire plot. The TARDIS team arrive on a ship where the Becoming, who are named after numbers, are present. They, however, are being stalked by vampires, and not the traditional kind, but instead ones who make you hallucinate your first love. It's a rather personal story for all involved, and I think the highlight of this episode is seeing how the vampires affect the Doctor, Liv and Helen in very different ways. Helen thinks back to a rather intimate encounter with one of her friends at school, Liv thinks back to a time on Caldor, and the Doctor, well, there's an interesting story going on there, which I will leave for you to find out yourself. It's a great way to exercise some of the vulnerabilities within this TARDIS team, allowing us as listeners to kind of get to know these companions a little bit more personally, exposing aspects of these rather familiar characters, which, let's face it, we've got to know now for quite a number of years, showing how they think about the past, but also how they support each other in coming to terms with these emotions. I think perhaps this episode does miss a little bit of an opportunity to do something with Liv, because at the very start of this story she does actually do a little bit of medical work, which I thought was a really nice way to kind of reintroduce, let's face it, her career on Caldor, but also show her expertise, and that then doesn't particularly lead to anything. But then at the same time, because we have a story focused around relationships and love, it may have been nice to draw on the plot of Tanya, of course, from Stranded, especially given that the next episode in the box set is Albie's Angels, a very personal story for Helen Sinclair. I do worry that perhaps Liv is getting left behind ever so slightly. Her relationship with Tanya has kind of been put on pause after the events of Stranded, and we have her acknowledging the fact that there is now a distance between them, and maybe just her reminiscing on that relationship and discussing it. I think it would be incredibly naive to say that Tanya was her first ever love, so I completely get why she's not in this story, and instead we have a character who is rather Doctor-esque on Caldor, which I quite like that callback to that series. It would have been great if they could have maybe had a bit of a cameo from Claire Rushbrook as Liv Chenka, because I absolutely love the robots as a spin-off series, just to kind of connect them a bit more, I suppose. But yeah, I just think that perhaps there is a few things that I would like to see presented with Liv that we've not quite delved into yet. The concept of the vampires themselves definitely sells the concept more than the actual character, which seems quite unusual to say. Perhaps maybe a few additional scenes seeing the vampires play on the love lives of the ship crew within the early half of the story may have boosted their presence as a threat. If it wasn't for this TARDIS team's rather strong bond, I think the overall concept may have been at risk of falling flat. The story also clocks in at around 51 minutes in length, so there was certainly enough time to maybe add in an extra scene or two just to pad out the story, again perhaps maybe utilising Liv, or really showing the threat of the vampires essentially through disposing of some of the crew in the early half of the story in a really gruesome way, because I think the whole idea of the character is really ominous, this idea that you're hallucinating your first love and the kind of sort of draw you in like a Venus flytrap. I think all that use of emotion is very, very clever and really effective. And I think that perhaps they could have just used that a bit more. They could have been really, really cruel with it. But I think that the story perhaps doesn't go as far as it potentially could. But I did still enjoy the concept. Albie's Angels concludes Connections, and without a doubt it is the highlight of the set. The Weeping Angels are back, and Roy Gill tugs on the heartstrings of every single listener who has been following this range across the years. I know some do not consider Big Finish as the same as TV Doctor Who, but as time goes on, I think that line is certainly starting to blur for me personally. This TARDIS team has now been one that I've heard bond since my mid-teens. I'm now finishing university and I can recall listening to this TARDIS team together in college. As characters, they have been around for quite a while, so personally, you do feel quite a connection with them. The Doctor lands the TARDIS in 2025 after some weird time signals are detected. This leads the team to investigate, and Helen comes across a record shop and is sent back in time rather cruelly by the owner being Mr. Harper. She wakes up in a rather popular date for Doctor Who history, being 1963, and the record shop remains. However, she sees a familiar face. Her lost brother, Albie, who was previously learnt about within the Stranded series. Due to Big Finish kind of moving away from the large quadrilogy format, I would like to mention that for starters, this story gives all of the context that you really need to know in order to enjoy the episode, featuring some flashbacks to Stranded, which did of course initially introduce the whole concept of Albie. So by listening to this episode and having not heard Stranded, you're not exactly in a disadvantage or anything like that. Albie was initially introduced in a little bit of a revelation scene really at the very end of the Stranded story Unit Dating, also written by Roy Gill. I'm so happy that Roy Gill has been allowed to explore this revelation a lot further. I think for those of us that have listened to that story when that box set was initially released, that kind of period of waiting time that we've had for this story to come out has really caused quite a lovely impact to finally know that this story is being told, and especially now that I've listened to this story, it was certainly worth the wait. Since the days of Doom Coalition, Helen Sinclair has been developed massively, and I will hold my hands up and say, at the concluding point of Doom Coalition, I was fully behind the idea of Helen being sacrificed to kind of further the plot and deliver a lot of impact to show the casualties of Doom Coalition as a series. I genuinely didn't mind her character departing, and then Stranded came along, and it really helped this TARDIS team blossom, and I think it was because we were in one static location and they needed to face the problems of day-to-day life, and all of a sudden these companions which have been jumping around the universe with so many things going on, all of these distractions essentially were forced to stop, and subsequently it has created a very powerful TARDIS team, meaning this TARDIS team that we now once again see venturing in time and space are very, very different in a positive way to the TARDIS team that we got to see in Doom Coalition, which I think started to stagnate a little bit, and we didn't particularly have too much development, and the plot was certainly, in my opinion, coming over in priority than character development. I'm really happy that Roy Gill in particular is the writer creating this story, because we do have some of those themes sort of being transported across from Unit Dating, a very successful story that a lot of people enjoyed, and subsequently we have them being applied here in a very different context, but again creating a very human, important story. Within this story, we also have Liv acknowledging her discomfort of being back in a time similar to when Stranded is set, and where of course Tanya is still around living, but she's not quite ready to reunite with her just yet. I'm glad that this story acknowledges the existence of Stranded and the various implications from it. It was one of my fears when I heard that the quadrilogy format was coming to an end, that we would move away from the flow and direction to random wanderings in time, and I'm really hoping that we get to see more of this in the series in the future. Robert Whitelock is absolutely superb as Mr. Harper, and when I say superb, I absolutely hate him. A horrible character and the perfect accompaniment to the Weeping Angels. He's just one of those people that is really, really unpleasant, and he does of course have a rather crucial role within the Robots spin-off series, so it's lovely to see Robert Whitelock once again uniting with Nicola Walker, with a very different character, but still very, very stern, very much like Skellen. This story is less about the Don't Blink concept often associated with the Weeping Angels, but more an exploration of sending people backwards in time, and how this can be exploited. And in my opinion, I think it is done a lot better than how it has been presented within some of the TV stories. I like how Roy has centred this episode all around the record shop. It's very personal to him, as I know that Roy loves records, so subsequently it really does create a personal epicenter centre for the story, which is in turn a very personal narrative with a very important story at its heart. Barnaby Jago is superb as Albie. The relationship he has with Helen is really beautiful, seeing them become friends over the course of the narrative's duration. I think it's really beautiful the way that they come together, because we have to start with them being friends, but it's soon very clear that there is a fundamental connection between them, and I think that both of them know that something else is drawing them together, so subsequently we have this very authentic, proximate relationship between them. The story explores the attitudes towards homosexual men within this time period and the dangers they face. The horrifying and frankly disgusting position of the law, and the scary fact that this whole story is hardly set in the distant past. Incredibly, this story features reference to none other than Trevor Baxter, who does of course play Professor George Lightfoot within the Doctor Who spin-off series Jekyll and Lightfoot, as well as originally appearing within the 4th Doctor story, The Talons of Weng-Chiang. It is a series that I absolutely love, so it was lovely to hear reference to him throughout this series, but also very emotional. I love the way that a recollection to a life story that Trevor has mentioned behind the scenes of Big Finish, but also within a number of interview documentaries, has kind of been implemented into the creation of this story. I absolutely love how Roy has presented this story within the Doctor Who universe. It brought a tear to my eye, and I love the way that Lightfoot's story lives on. The matter of this story is difficult and hard-hitting, and some may argue that science fiction is not the way to explore such themes. Here, the Weeping Angels are used as almost a catalyst to bring the story to life, without simply landing the TARDIS within the time period. But what I like is the way that Roy Gill also takes the Weeping Angels on an exciting journey, despite not being the key focus of the story, which is absolutely fine, as there is a much more important message to be told within this episode. But the inclusion of the Weeping Angels definitely adds to the overall story itself, but I think the human side of it, without a doubt, is that key focus. I don't want to say too much else about this story without the fear of ruining it, but at the end we do have a stunning and lovely monologue delivered by Hattie Morahan, again one of her strongest performances to date, and I love how Liv and the Doctor's involvement is somewhat minimal, but when they do get involved, they are present to support their friend in any way they can. So in summary for Albie's Angels, I think if you are a Big Finish listener who has been following the adventures of Liv Chenka and Helen Sinclair, this episode is an essential listen. It is a fundamental moment within Helen's timeline, which essentially dates all the way back to her debut within Doom Coalition, The Red Lady. It's a really emotional, powerful story, and one of which there is a perfect blend of science fiction, but also a very human, scary, but also historical event, which I'm very happy to see represented within the Doctor Who universe. I think that you can very much judge by the ratio of the different episode discussions within this review that Albie's Angels is without a doubt the highlight of this box set, and I think that it's one of those episodes that is very thought-provoking and definitely stays in the mind long after listening to the episode itself, so I do most certainly recommend this box set alone solely for this story, and the other 2 episodes within the set are also exciting space adventures as well. It's great to finally see this TARDIS team free of the shackles of Stranded and the various implications of that series. I just hope that that direction continues for the future sets, and we get to see perhaps the inclusion of a subtle plot arc that ties the stories together, and maybe even a bit of a journey for Liv in particular, given that we've had quite a focus on Helen within this story. So there we have it, that is my review of Doctor Who The 8th Doctor Adventures, Connections. I really hope you have enjoyed it. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for regular Big Finish reviews. Have a nice day, and I shall see you all next time.